Hello everybody and welcome back to another Overwatch League fan thoughts and analysis video. Today we will be going over both Week 5, in retrospect of course, looking back at Week 5, and looking ahead to the Stage 1 playoffs, which will be starting on Thursday. So, let's start of course by looking back at what happened in Week 5. The first game was Saturday, March 16th, between the Paris Eternal and the Washington Justice, and the Paris Eternal, in order to make playoffs for the stage, needed a lot of things to happen, but the thing that they needed to do was they could not lose a single map, and they could only, at worst, draw once. And unfortunately for the Paris Eternal, they beat the Washington Justice by a score of 2-1, which eliminated them from stage playoff contention with their win. It's still a win, of course, and a win is a win. A win is not a bad thing. They end their 4-game losing streak, or 3-game losing streak. But, you gotta feel like the team was much better, and then they started to really slide. So I'm excited and interested to see what they do in the Stage 2 meta, which I don't expect to be all that different. Maybe somewhat different, but not too different. But we will see going forward. Next was my big pick game for Saturday, and that was the Seoul Dynasty and the London Spitfire going at it. The winner would have a much better chance, or a very increased chance, of making stage playoffs, while the loser would be eliminated from stage playoff contention. Seoul Dynasty walked away with the win there, eliminating the London Spitfire and putting Seoul Dynasty at a differential that they were tied with the San Francisco Shock at 4-3 plus 5. We will get back to that here in a little bit. But the Dynasty, what they really needed was to ensure that Boston lost, or if Boston won, that it was by a small enough score that they would not tie the Seoul Dynasty. And while I picked the Dallas Fuel to win, the Boston Uprising ultimately walked away with the win. But it was only it was a 3-2 victory, so their differential only went up by 1, which meant that the Seoul Dynasty had a good spot to lock in the playoffs. So the San Francisco Shock and Seoul Dynasty both got locked into playoffs with the Boston Uprising's win over the Dallas Fuel. Boston Uprising did not lock up a spot, though. They still needed things to happen around them. Sorry for hitting the mic. But the Atlanta Reign took on the Chengdu Hunters in a big game for both the Dallas Fuel and the Houston Outlaws, two teams whose playoff hopes would be crushed if the Atlanta Reign walked away with a victory against the Chengdu Hunters. And the Chengdu Hunters managed to get a win, a dominant win, a 4-0 victory against the Atlanta Reign. Atlanta did not look all that great. It was a struggle for them. Chengdu Hunters looked pretty good. They put themselves in a decent position going forward into the future stages, and it'll be exciting to see what they do going forward. Sunday, we had the Philadelphia Fusion taking on the Paris Eternal. Philadelphia would lock in a stage playoff spot with a win over Paris, and they did just that. It was 3-2, I believe. So, good win for them. May have been 3-1. It was a good win for them, though. And it left them tied with the Toronto Defiant at 5-2 plus 5. So, two teams ending the stage at 2 losses with the Fusion and the Defiant. Pretty good stages for them. Relatively dominant performances from them throughout the season, or throughout the stage. So, well, maybe not Philadelphia, but Toronto had some good wins. So, those two teams, we'll talk about their tiebreaker here in a little bit, as well as the tiebreaker between the Shock and the Dynasty. Second game on Sunday was the Washington Justice taking on the Florida Mayhem. I picked Florida to beat the winless Washington Justice in Florida. They did it. They were the first team to lose to the Washington Justice. The Washington Justice become the 20th team in the Overwatch League to win a game as a franchise, which means every single team in the Overwatch League has won a game. Not this season, I'm saying in general. Obviously, the LA Valiant still winless this stage, but they were the number 2 overall team last year, so they had some wins, of course. So every team now in the Overwatch League with a win makes it better if every team has a win. makes it more competitive, makes it more fun. We move on to the second to last game on Sunday, the Atlanta Reign taking on the Houston Outlaws. A win for the Atlanta Reign would eliminate Houston. A win for Houston didn't do much, depending on the size of it. They could tie with Dallas with a 3-2 win. They could tie with Boston with a 4-0 win. Any win in between would put them in between. But the Atlanta Reign snuffed out the Outlaws' hopes of winning with a 3-1 victory over the Houston Outlaws, giving them a 4-3 plus 6 record for the stage and putting them in at the number 5 spot in the stage playoffs. The final game of the week was the Guangzhou Charge and the Vancouver Titans, a rematch of an earlier match that was 3-2. The Vancouver Titans, with a big enough win, could lock up the number 1 overall spot in the stage playoffs. The Guangzhou Charge, of course, with a win, would make stage playoffs, pushing Boston out. And the Vancouver Titans got the job done. Not only did they win, they won 4-0 and locked up the number 1 overall spot in the stage playoffs. So, after that game, of course, our 8 playoff teams were locked in. So let's take a look at the top 10 stage standings, which is, of course, headlined by the 8 stage playoff teams. The Vancouver Titans, at 7-0 plus 18, get the number 1 overall seed in the stage playoffs with the New York Excelsior, the same 7-0 record, but a plus 16 differential. They are there at number 2. Philadelphia Fusion and Toronto Defiant tied at 5-2 plus 5, had a tiebreaker coin flip that the Philadelphia Fusion won, so they will be the number 3 seed in the playoffs with the Toronto Defiant as the number 4 seed. The Atlanta Reign at 4-3 plus 6 are the 5 seed. The San Francisco Shock and Seoul Dynasty also were tied and had a tiebreaker. Their tiebreaker was an actual match, which the Shock won, so they will be the 6 and the Dynasty will be the 7. I want to note that the Fusion and Defiant agreed on doing a coin flip. I assume the Shock and Dynasty also agreed on doing a match. So that leaves the Boston Uprising at 4-3 plus 3 as the 8th team in the stage playoffs. Speaking of the stage playoffs, let's take a look at the bracket. As you can see, I've already filled the whole thing out for you, so you can just look and see who I picked if that's what you really want. Or you can, of course, hear my reasoning. Or you can do both. Who would have thought? No harm in doing either, now is there? So, Thursday, when we get the first 2 games, we will have the Seoul Dynasty taking on the New York Excelsior at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And the Boston Uprising will take on the Vancouver Titans at 11 p.m. Eastern Time. So, we have the battle between 7-2 and 8-1. And I am taking both of the higher seeds in that one. Taking New York against Seoul. New York already played Seoul once. They beat him pretty handily. Obviously, they dropped a map against them, but that was a really close map, really exciting map. And New York made some mistakes, I think, that didn't need to be made, but ultimately walked away with a win anyway. Then you have Boston Uprising, who have not played the Vancouver Titans, and they did play New York, and they played them relatively closely. Vancouver, of course, very aggressive style, kind of similar to what Boston plays. I just have too many question marks surrounding Boston to put them in a victory over the team in the number 1 spot, who has been playing as well as they have, of course, being Vancouver. Then on Friday, March 22nd, we have the Atlanta Reign taking on the Toronto Defiant at 9 p.m. Eastern. That one will be on ESPN, as well as the ESPN app for the Seoul Dynasty and New York series and the Boston-Vancouver series. But if you want to watch on Twitch, you can do that, or you can watch on ESPN the Atlanta Reign taking on the Toronto Defiant. For that one, I have the Toronto Defiant winning, getting revenge against the Atlanta Reign for the time they played earlier in the season. I think the Defiant are the better team as of right now. I think they've looked better recently. They're playing at full strength. They're playing as the team that we anticipated they would eventually be. They look so much better. So, taking the Defiant against the Reign. And then, San Francisco Shock take on the Philadelphia Fusion. And while the Shock are the 6th seed, they are a better team right now, in my opinion, than the Philadelphia Fusion are. I think the Shock have looked far better. The Fusion have looked kind of questionable, especially with the way they're doing main tank. They're running a Winston Goats for the most part when Reinhardt Goats is better, but they're still running Winston, even though they have a Reinhardt player in the back. It's a whole kind of confusing thing. Philadelphia won the games they needed to win, and they've been winning still, but they haven't really played a great team. They played one team that made the playoffs, and that would be the Atlanta Reign, who they did beat. But they didn't play anybody else that made playoffs. They beat London. They lost to Dallas. They lost to Florida. The only team to lose to Florida so far this season. Yeah, they beat Paris. Philadelphia is a very questionable team right now. I don't think many people would say San Francisco is the worst team. San Francisco has 3 losses, but 2 of those were New York and Vancouver. And the other one was, I believe, the LA Gladiators, who were playing very, very well at that point in time. So, I'm going to take the Shock for that one. I think they're right now the better team. I think right now the 4 best teams are the Titans, the Excelsior, the Defiant, and the Shock. Not necessarily in that order, but I think they are right now the best 4 teams. So, it'll be exciting to see those 4 teams hopefully meet in the Stage 1 semifinals. Obviously not all against each other, but the Titans taking on the Defiant and the Shock taking on the Excelsior. The Titans taking on the Defiant will be a really cool game. I hope we get to see it because that is a battle between 2 Canadian teams, which we'll only see one other time throughout the season, so I'm hoping we get to see it because that's just a really exciting thing to see. I'm going to take the Vancouver Titans. I don't think it's absurd to think the Defiant could win that game, could upset the Vancouver Titans and walk away with the victory, but I just think the Titans are very good. No real reason to pick against a team that hasn't lost a game yet. And the same goes for me with New York. We did see New York beat San Francisco. So New York has kind of a tricky situation here where they're playing if they beat Seoul and if San Francisco beats Philadelphia, they're playing 2 teams back to back that they've already played. So that is both good and bad. It's good because you know how to play them. You've done it once. You kind of know how they play. But it's bad because the other team also knows that, right? So there is benefits to playing teams twice. This is a very tough game for both teams, I think. Obviously, New York won the first meeting with San Francisco 4-0. It was a much closer game than the scoreline would have suggested. New York, of course, got kind of lucky at times and played really well also. So this is a very close series. I'm still going to take New York. They won the first matchup. No reason to pick against them. They haven't lost a game yet this stage. They look very good, very dominant in most of their matches, if not all of their matches, besides the San Francisco one that they still walked away with a 4-0 victory. So even in close games, they're taking away wins, and there's not a lot of teams that do that. Vancouver did that against San Francisco as well, which maybe could be a failing of the San Francisco Shock. But overall, New York has looked better, so I'm taking them to meet the Vancouver Titans in the finals. You can see, of course, who I'm picking. Probably something that people will disagree with. At least some people will, but I'm taking the New York Excelsior to beat the Vancouver Titans, and I know what people are going to say. You're an NYXL fan, so of course you're taking the New York Excelsior, and I won't say that isn't a part of the reasoning why I picked New York, but that's not the main reason. That's not the ultimate reason. It's not even the major reason. The main reason why I'm taking New York is because I think New York has looked better, especially as of late, than Vancouver. Now, I didn't watch Vancouver against Guangzhou. I see that 4-0 scoreline. Seems like a pretty dominant win for Vancouver. I want to go back and watch it at some point. Just been busy and haven't had the chance to do so. But New York, I think, have looked better as of late than they did early on. Where Vancouver, I think they've had some ups and downs. They had that struggle against Chengdu, who was kind of a bad team. They're not awful, but they're not great. And they struggled against them when they ran goats and when they didn't run goats. They barely beat them on Route 66. Very close matchup between those two teams. Could have easily been a Chengdu Hunters victory. The Vancouver Titans, of course, just managed to close it out. In a lot of ways, kind of luck. New York, I just think they've been more consistent. They've improved significantly since the very beginning. They played a very close series with the LA Valley, in which everyone is like, oh, that means New York's a bad team, or that, that's a really, really telling series, but it's really not. These are two teams that are very familiar with each other. They were scrim partners for a lot of the inaugural season, so they're two teams that are very familiar with each other. Those are the kinds of things that are going to be close. You look at something like the NFL, right? Divisional games are always tougher than any other type of game because if you're in the division with a team that you play multiple times a year, every year, you start to get to know these teams very well. You get to know the players very well, and things are very similar. It's the same thing if you're scrimming as a team all the time. If you're playing the same team in scrims every week, for every match, pretty much, you're going to get very familiar with those teams. So with that in mind, that win, while it was 3-2, and people were saying it was a really close win, really close for comfort, you look at the way New York played against a team like San Francisco, who they're not as familiar with, and they walked away with a 4-0 victory. They walked away with, some big victories against Washington, and they walked away with a huge 4-0 victory against Houston. That, to me, is a really big win right there. New York has looked better as of late. They obviously don't have Arc anymore, traded to the Washington Justice. But Animo has been playing exceptionally. He's been playing the most of the stage, if not, the two times that they subbed Arc in after the series had already been won. I can't pick against the team who has made every single stage playoff, who has looked, in my opinion, stronger in recent weeks. Obviously, things could change with the way they play against Seoul, or even potentially the way they play against San Francisco or Philadelphia, if they even make it to those games. And who knows if Vancouver will even make it that far. But New York has a benefit in the fact that they have played against 4 of the teams in the playoffs. They played Seoul, beat them. They played San Francisco, beat them. They played Toronto, beat them. They played Boston, beat them. Vancouver played the Shock and beat them. New York has beaten half of the teams in this playoff field, and obviously one of the teams on the other half is them, so they physically couldn't have beaten them. So New York has a very, very strong strength of schedule, much stronger than Vancouver's strength of schedule. And while New York did also play the Valiant and the Justice, who are, combined for one win, they had some very big wins in there, right? And the other win that they had was, of course, the 4-0 against Houston. So it's hard to say that New York is the worst team right now. Big wins against half of the field of this playoff. I gotta take New York. That's really what it comes down to. I'd love to hear your own opinions. I'd love to hear who you are taking. I would love to hear if you are a person taking Vancouver Titans, your reasoning for it. Especially, that would be the most interesting to me. Hearing someone who disagrees with me and their reasoning for why. It'd be very, very fun to hear for me. But let's take a look at the overall division standings. We can see, of course, no movement at the top. The Excelsior and the Titans still as the number one teams in their divisions. The Fusion and the Shock now, because of their victories and their tiebreakers, sitting at the 2 spots in theirs with the Defiant and the Dynasty underneath them. At the bottom, we of course have some change in the Atlantic, with the Washington Justice now ahead of the Florida Mayhem, putting the Florida Mayhem as, I would say, arguably the worst team in the league. I think they're worse than the Valiant are, but Valiant are winless. We'll see how that goes for both of those teams, all 3 of those teams, I guess, really, and see how they improve. But the Pacific Division, man, is looking pretty interesting, very close. The Atlantic, of course, 5 teams in the stage playoffs. It's a crazy, crazy number. Not what I expected at all at the start of the season. I genuinely expected the Pacific Division to be the stronger one with more playoff teams. But right now, if the season were to end, looking very likely that there would be more Atlantic teams than Pacific teams. But that is where I'm going to end this video off. If you enjoyed, consider liking and subscribing. Also, comment down below your picks for the stage playoffs, your reasonings why, all that kind of stuff. I'd love to hear it, love to have a discussion about it. But until the next video, I'm going to get out of here. So thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time, and bye-bye.